one of the most important topics, and that is field surveys. What do we actually do when we are trying to understand field surveys? We are trying to understand how a research authentically takes place. So you personally go to the field, collect the data, gather the information, and then you proceed with your research. But a very important thing to keep in mind here is when you are proceeding with your research, you have certain points in mind, you have the problem, you have the objective, you go for the tools and techniques, data collection and analysis, but the same goes with this research field survey also, and that is the most crucial part of it. So let's understand with a very simple example. I want to do a field survey on any of the topics, let's say a very simple topic, to understand the levels of income or the level of poverty in the village scenario. Now I have three different households to demonstrate you what actually it is. I'm trying to gather the information at a local level. So what I do is I move from house 1, I go to house 2, house 3 and collect all the information, and I'm back with all the records. Now this records that I have collected, I'm trying to understand the association, the relationship between various facts. I'm trying to facilitate it at local level of information and understand the depth of the problem. Once I am able to understand the depth of the problem, I can definitely proceed with a very quality research. Now, once we have gathered the information, but we will do the analysis of the information, but what is the actual process that is required? I simply don't go and jump into a field to collect the data. There are certain steps and guidelines that need to be followed or kept in mind. So the first important thing that we take into account is problem. What actually I need to study? If I simply go to a village and say I am here for a field research, there is no point in it, because I don't have my mental picture clear what I actually want to do. So you have to think about why this research is, what is the actual cause or a problem that you are trying to find out. The next important thing that we try to understand here is objectives. Objectives imply we create a kind of outline, what all things we will take into account, how we will acquire the data, how we would analyze the data. So a kind of broad framework of the whole process would be part of your objective. So this is something I want to find out. If I am talking about understanding the levels of poverty, I want to find out the levels of inequality that are there. How can I measure the poverty? What are parameters I would consider while creating my questionnaire? So all those things would be your objective. The next is the scope. How do I actually visualize this? I visualize this in a very simple form. It could be either on the ground, which areas, which pockets I am trying to study. So we call it the spatial dimension. The next important dimension is across time, how the things have been varying across time. So we call it a temporal dimension. And the third is the themes that are there. So these themes are what are very important. What all aspects do you need to cover? What all conditions you are trying to cover would be part of the scope. The next important criteria that we understand is the tools and the techniques. Now what do we understand under tools and techniques? Under tools and techniques, we try to find out the publications of the data. We try to either do a field observation, rely on secondary data. So I can go to a village headman, collect certain information. I can go to a Gram Panchayat office, collect certain information. So that would be a secondary source. I can take interviews of, let's say, the health in charge of the village or the village CMO. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take information through interview methods. So sometimes I can physically go and measure certain things. How deep is the groundwater level if I'm trying to understand groundwater analysis, for example. So all those are part of tools and techniques. So under tools and techniques, we not only try to understand whether the information is from a secondary source, whether it's observation, whether it's interview, but we also try to understand that we are trying to gather certain information. So what should be the criteria? Which households to cover? What age group should be there? What kind of population I am catering? What is the socio-economic standard that I am focusing on? Which pockets I am focusing more? Why is the reason, or why it is so that I am focusing more on certain regions, less on other regions? Now, besides the questionnaire, observation plays an important role, because sometimes I can simply go into the field, I can observe things around, and I can put those into remark and understand why they are so important. However, they were not part of the questionnaire, because when I was preparing the questionnaire for the field survey, or when I was, let's say, jotting down the points in my mind, these things never came into my mind, it never struck my mind. So that is again a very, very important aspect. We also focus on the sketch, the photography that is there, or sometimes interviews, as we said, are very, very crucial. So once we are done with all this, the next most important step is compilation. I have so much data which is varied. Some is secondary data, some is from interviews, some is from observations, some is from questionnaire or schedules. What I do is I gather all that information, I try to bring it under one head, and once it is under one head, I can bring in compilation and analyze the data. Based on this compilation, what I do, I calculate my results and do an analysis. Now, this analysis is further presented. So, presentation is important. How do you present? It could be tables, graphs, charts, it could be flow diagrams, it could be analysis of the report, it could be a poster presentation that could be there, it could be an n number of ways under which you can present your findings. Now, why do we do a case study and how do we actually proceed? To be or to do a case study, one very important criteria is we have to be very, very open-minded. That means our ideas should be very, very clear. We as a surveyor cannot have opinions. The person who is giving the interview, the person who is filling us or helping us fill the questionnaire can have opinions, but we as a surveyor cannot form opinions. So we have to be very, very neutral, unbiased. Again, we have to be courteous and friendly with the people. We should not be having an attitude of simply visiting that, asking what is it and filling it off. Most probably you won't get a good response. Unbiased and a actual response would come only when you try to develop friendly relation, a friendly attitude with them. Also, a very, very important thing to note here is what? Do not make any kind of promise. Do not say that we are here to collect the data, this data would go somewhere and there would be some changes in your locality, in line of which you can understand that you are asking them to speak truth. But no, that's not the correct way. It's an unethical practice, rather we could say. So avoid asking questions that might hurt their feelings. Avoid doing the acts that might hurt their sentiments. Do not make false promises, do not make false commitments, and record each and every detail that is given by the respondents. Now, what are the various ways under which case studies could be done? I can do a case study of a region where there was a very less rainfall, a drought condition that was seen. Now, this drought condition was seen where? It could be seen, let's say, in parts of Thar Desert in Rajasthan. On the contrary, you have floods. It could be seen in the regions of Assam, Bihar, West Bengal. So those are flood prone areas. Similarly, you could have the Bimaru states, high proportion of poverty levels that could be seen. Energy issues, renewable sources, non-renewable sources, alternative energy, using energy in, let's say, railways. So what are the various pictures that could come into mind? The land use, the changes in the land use, groundwater analysis, pollution levels, air pollution, smog in Delhi is a very, very common issue every winter. So those are some of the things or the case studies that could immediately come to your mind. So today what we would be doing is we would be in particular focusing on two case studies. One is related to poverty and another is to the drought conditions. How would you proceed in each of the scenario? So let's say in the case study of poverty, I first have a problem statement. My problem is this poverty is very closely linked to inequality. Now before I begin, let's talk about poverty a little. What is poverty line? Poverty line is a critical threshold level of income consumption and access to the basic facilities that are seen. So it could be absolute poverty, it could be a relative poverty. And absolute poverty is where we say they do not have the basic access to the livelihood facilities. But what is a relative poverty? Relative poverty is one of my friends has a two-wheeler, another has a four-wheeler. So a friend who has a two-wheeler can consider that the friend having a four-wheeler is relatively richer, or I am relatively poor. That is what is relative. It is not absolute. So each individual have their own relative aspects of being poor or rich. Now, again, a very important thing in mind is we have to understand whether the phenomena is chronic or temporary. Whether there was no rain for today, for this season, and therefore poverty was seen, or this has been in this area for generations. So that is again an important aspect that is to be kept in mind while creating the objectives. So that is where we strive on to forming the objectives. Now when we are developing objectives, we need to identify how to measure poverty. We also need to understand the basic levels of livelihood, the measurement of poverty, and the state of poverty, the present state of poverty and its implications. So all those things would go under the objectives. The next important aspect is how do you cover it. Again, as we said in the beginning, three important dimensions. Either you cover it spatially, which pockets have higher amount of poverty levels in contrast to another pockets which have less level of poverty levels. We can have a temporal understanding, how with time the scenario has worsened or scenario has improved. We can have a thematic understanding where we can say the socio-demographic levels, the healthcare, the income, the expenditure of an individual, all are important. Then next to it, we have another important point, that is tools and techniques, as we said. So I can gather secondary information. Now this secondary information could be from where? I can gather secondary information from Gram Panchayat office. I can talk about another level of information where I can have information from Tehsil level, block level, or from the Patwari. So whatever kind of secondary information comes to me is one source. The second source is observation. I go to the field, I see the condition of the people, what was not there in the questions. I even try to understand this. I put those as remark. Sometimes I interview the village headman. I talk about to the major service providers, the ASHA workers there. The next important thing that you can do is measure. You can measure the quantity of food being supplied to their house, the proportion of health, the proportion of weight of a child, height of a child. So all those would come under measurements. Then we can have a survey design. Now this survey design would include all the households, the land holdings they have, the amount of daily income they have, the social class, the social stratification that is there, the division of settlement, the division of labor that is there. So you can have households, the category, the land size they have, the location of the house, whether it is close to the main road, away from the main road. Understanding and compiling the data then becomes very important. So how do we compile? I first of all enter all the information into a computer system. Then I assign a unique identity to each household. So when I am trying to do a SQL or any kind of query that I am trying to run, I am immediately able to find out which households have these conditions, which households have condition A, which households have condition B, and which households have both condition A and B but not condition C. So whatever query I am trying to run, I can simply run it when once the data is there onto the computer system, and through the various programs, SPSS, Stata, or any other program, you can have quick compilation of the data that could be seen. So assigning unique code to each of those is important. Unique name for each attribute, and that should be same across tables, because if I am trying to gather information across tables, which we would understand in our class on SPSS later on, let's say I have the first table that is there. This first table talks about the individual households which I have assigned as 1, 2, 3, 4. The parameters related to the members of each household and the general household conditions. Now, each of this household parameter 1 is again related in the next table, where I am trying to understand the income level, the education level, the literacy level, and so on. So if I am trying to do a query between the income level and the family level, we are trying to understand how these two tables could be correlated if there is a common code that is assigned across the tables that is there. Now information on the each sheet would be used for the household codes. There would be verification and consistency checks. So the data is how much it is correct, what all correctness is required would be immediately checked. We would also try to compute the indices. Now these indices could be for the well-being of an individual, for assessing the level of poverty there, for assessing the level of educational development, the basic health care, the basic infrastructure, sanitation facilities, all those would then be summarized into tables. Now this summarization of tables is again important because this is where you would have the thematic mapping. Once I have summarized, I can map them. I can have a plot on, let's say, a GIS software or any other sheet where I am trying to physically find out the things and locate those. So either I can do a shading or any other methods that could be seen to give it much a more kind of impactful analysis that could be done with a thematic mapping. Then there could be presentations which could involve either thematic maps or tables, smart charts, diagrams, observations, and sometimes statistical analysis. So either I can have a mapping that could be there, or along with mapping there could be again a statistical analysis. What is the scenario that has been seen over the years? What is the future forecast that could be done? What is the association between the various parameters where there is higher level of joblessness, you have higher level of poverty, or any kind of certain associations that come up, how the poverty has been perpetuating deep into the roots, and finally based on all this you have a report that is written. Similar to this case study, we have another case study which is on drought, and this is from the region of Belgaum in Karnataka. So we first identify the problem. Now drought is a climatic dryness that is seen which is severe enough to reduce the amount of moisture that is present in the soil. As a result, it would lead to problems for basic livelihood, for agriculture, for industries, and for livestock as well. So there is a problem where there is deficiency of water. It would impact the lives of so many things. So how do we try to adjust these, and whether another problem statement is whether this drought is linked to the levels of hunger and malnourishment in the region. So what I do is I have certain objectives in mind. What are my objectives? I first identify the areas. I have a first-hand experience of those areas, and I try to create a preparedness. What we would do if there is another episode of drought that comes in, or what we have done so far, what would be the criteria that we would take into account. So what and how would you cover it? Whether you would cover these following regions, or whether this drought has been perennial, it has been there always, or it varies with the rainfall pattern. So the year there was more rainfall, less drought conditions, less rainfall, more drought conditions. We try to find out the association and the relation. So that is again the coverage. Whether it is based on time period, whether it is based on space, or whether it is based on certain thematic aspects. What do these thematic aspects means? These could be the land use, rainfall, it could be the status of vegetation, it could be the basic parameters that are required. The next important thing is, how do we do that? We definitely have certain tools and techniques in mind. So again, the same thing as we did in the last session. We have techniques like, first of all, we go for a secondary data collection. Now this secondary data collection could be reports from Khasra, daily weather reports. We are trying to do statistical aspects. We also, abstracts are to be followed. We also focus on maps. Maps usually for these references we have on a scale of 1:50,000. Where we have a smaller detailed view of a specific region. We focus on the perennial and the non-perennial sources of the water that are there in those areas. We try to do observation. We try to see how the people are behaving, how they are conserving water, how they are utilizing water. Sometimes you can go out for measurement, measure the village boundaries, try or measure the amount of water that is present in each of the resources in the village. Take an interview of the key persons in the village or the common people around in the village. See how the fodder is affected, the domestic water supply is affected, the healthcare infrastructure is affected, the hunger level or the malnourishment levels are affected. The next is, what do is we compile and compute the data. So when we are trying to compile and compute, first of all the information we have collected so far, we would enter into our systems as we said. So computerized entry, Then we verify for checks and consistencies, whether it is related, whether the data is correct or not, whether everything is fixed or not. We compute the various indices that are there, create a visual presentation. Now, visual presentation is very, very impactful. So you can use a thematic map that could be there, talking about the impact of drought under certain scenarios, what are the measures that could be taken to reduce it, focus on statistical analysis and tabulation as one of the ways. So after everything is done, we finally come up with writing reports. So report writing is another important step that we need to take into account here. Illustrations can be used, maps, diagrams, graphs, bar charts, photographs, sketches, whatsoever. The idea is to reveal whole of the study that you have done into the best possible form. So this was something that we have talked about, field surveys and field studies, a very, very important chapter before you begin any kind of research, any kind of thesis writing, any kind of dissertation writing. What things you need to keep in mind from a geographical and a non-geographical perspective as well. What are the dimensions you take into account? How do you criterize your objectives? You bring in the tools and techniques which are apt for the field survey that you are using, and finally, how do you compile and bring in your report writing? We would be covering many more interesting lectures. Stay tuned, stay subscribed. Have a wonderful day ahead.